Margaret wiped the dust from her windowsill for the third time that morning, watching the empty street stretch toward the horizon like a faded ribbon under the desert sun. The town of Cedar Falls had grown quiet in recent months, with most families moving on toward California or back east, where opportunities seemed brighter and the future held more promise. At 58, Margaret had learned to find comfort in small routines and quiet moments, yet today felt different somehow, as if the very air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. The sound of horses approaching broke through her thoughts, and she peered through the lace curtains her late husband Henry had surprised her with on their 20th anniversary. 3 men rode slowly down the main street, their faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats and their posture speaking of official business that rarely brought good news to small towns like theirs. Behind them walked another figure, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she realized the man's hands were bound with rope, his shirt torn and bloodied, his face bearing the marks of rough treatment. She had seen enough of life's harsh realities during her 62 years to recognize injustice when it appeared before her door, even when it wore the badge of the law. The procession stopped directly in front of the old oak tree that had stood sentinel in the town square for as long as anyone could remember, its branches thick and strong enough to bear terrible weight. Sheriff Coleman dismounted first, his weathered face showing no emotion as he surveyed the nearly empty street with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Thomas Riley," he called out in a voice that carried the authority of his position, "you stand accused of horse theft and assault upon a peace officer." The bound man lifted his head, and Margaret could see he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 35, with kind eyes that seemed at odds with the charges being leveled against him. "Sheriff Coleman," Thomas said quietly, "I've told you the truth of what happened, and I'll tell it again if it matters, but we both know you've already made up your mind about this." Margaret found herself moving toward the door before she had consciously decided to do so, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the brass handle Henry had polished so carefully every Sunday morning. The street felt larger somehow as she stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, her footsteps echoing in the unusual silence that had settled over the town like a heavy blanket. "Excuse me, Sheriff Coleman," she said, approaching the group with the steady grace that had carried her through decades of life's challenges, both joyful and sorrowful. The sheriff turned toward her, his expression showing mild irritation at the interruption, though he touched his hat brim in the polite gesture expected when addressing a lady. "Mrs. Henderson, this is official business, and I'd ask you to return to your home until we've concluded our work here." Margaret looked past him to Thomas Riley, whose eyes met hers with a mixture of gratitude and resignation that spoke of a man who had given up hope but still appreciated human kindness. "What evidence do you have against this man?" she asked, keeping her voice level despite the rapid beating of her heart. Deputy Wells stepped forward, eager to assert his authority in front of the few townspeople who had begun to gather at a respectful distance from the proceedings. "He was found with Samuel Morrison's horse, Mrs. Henderson, and when we approached him he struck Deputy Garcia and attempted to flee the scene." Thomas shook his head slowly, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion and frustration. "The horse was wandering loose on the road, injured and limping, and I was trying to help it when these men rode up with guns drawn." Margaret studied the young man's face, seeing the honesty that seemed to shine from his eyes despite the circumstances that had brought him to this moment. She had raised 3 sons and buried 2 of them young, and she recognized the look of a good man caught in circumstances beyond his control. "Where is Samuel Morrison?" she asked, turning back to Sheriff Coleman. "Surely he should be here to identify his property and give testimony about how it came to be missing." The sheriff's jaw tightened slightly, and Margaret realized she had touched upon something he preferred not to discuss in public. "Morrison is recovering from injuries sustained during the alleged attack, Mrs. Henderson, and the doctor has advised against moving him at this time." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story than he was willing to share, and Margaret felt the familiar stirring of intuition that had guided her through many difficult decisions. "Then perhaps we should wait until he can speak for himself," she suggested. "Surely justice can afford to be patient when a man's life hangs in the balance." Deputy Wells laughed harshly, his youth making him eager to demonstrate his authority. "Justice has been patient enough, ma'am, and the evidence speaks for itself clearly enough." Margaret looked again at Thomas Riley, seeing not a hardened criminal but a man who reminded her of her eldest son David, who had possessed the same gentle strength and quiet dignity. "What's your story, Thomas?" she asked directly, ignoring the sheriff's obvious displeasure at her continued interference. Thomas straightened slightly, his voice gaining strength from her willingness to listen. I was traveling from Tucson toward my sister's place in Colorado when I came upon a horse standing in the middle of the road favoring its front left leg. He paused, gathering his thoughts while Margaret waited patiently, understanding that truth often took time to emerge fully. The poor creature was clearly in pain and I could see it had been ridden hard recently, so I dismounted to examine the leg and try to help. Sheriff Coleman interrupted impatiently. A convenient story that explains nothing about how Morrison came to be injured or why you ran when approached by lawful authority. Thomas met the sheriff's gaze steadily. I ran because 3 armed men came charging toward me shouting accusations and threats, and I've seen enough frontier justice to know that explanations often come too late to save a man's neck. Margaret felt a chill run through her as she recognized the truth in his words, having witnessed the swift and sometimes careless administration of justice in frontier towns. She thought of Henry, who had served briefly as a deputy in their younger days and who had often spoken of the weight of responsibility that came with wearing a badge. "Sheriff Coleman," she said carefully, "I wonder if you might allow me to speak with Thomas privately for a moment." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your concern, but this is not a social call and we have procedures to follow." Margaret drew herself up to her full height, channeling the authority that had made her a respected voice in the community for more than 3 decades. "I'm not asking you to release him or abandon your duties, but surely a few minutes of conversation between neighbors poses no threat to justice." Deputy Wells started to object, but Sheriff Coleman raised his hand for silence, his eyes studying Margaret with the calculation of a man trying to determine her motivations. "5 minutes, Mrs. Henderson, and I want your word that you won't attempt anything foolish." Margaret nodded solemnly, understanding that she was being given an opportunity that might not come again. She approached Thomas slowly, her maternal instincts fully engaged as she saw the hope that flickered in his tired eyes. "Tell me about your sister," she said quietly. Thomas smiled for the first time since she had been watching, and the transformation in his face confirmed her growing certainty about his character. "Sarah's the youngest of his 5 children, and she married a good man who owns a small ranch outside Denver." He paused, his voice softening with affection. "She's expecting her first child and asked me to come help with the harvest before the baby arrives." Margaret felt her heart tighten with emotion, recognizing the love and responsibility that had motivated his journey. "And you've never been in trouble with the law before?" Thomas shook his head emphatically. "No ma'am, my father raised us to respect authority and treat others with dignity, and I've tried to live by those principles." Margaret believed him completely, her decades of experience with people confirming what her intuition had already told her. She turned back toward Sheriff Coleman, her mind working quickly as she considered her options. "Sheriff, I'd like to post bond for Thomas Riley." The sheriff's eyebrows rose in surprise while Deputy Wells stepped forward with obvious objection. "Mrs. Henderson, this man is charged with serious crimes and bond is not typically granted in such cases." Margaret reached into her reticule, withdrawing a small leather pouch that contained most of her household savings. "I'm willing to guarantee his appearance at trial with everything I own," she said steadily, "my house, my late husband's business interests, and all my personal property." Thomas stared at her in amazement. "Ma'am, you don't even know me, and I couldn't ask you to risk so much for a stranger." Margaret met his eyes with the gentle firmness that had guided her through decades of motherhood. "Thomas, I've raised 3 sons and buried 2 husbands, and I've learned to recognize goodness when I see it." She turned back to the sheriff, her voice carrying quiet conviction. "This man is not a criminal, and I'm willing to stake everything I have on that belief." Sheriff Coleman studied her face, trying to determine if she was acting from wisdom or simple feminine sentiment. The crowd of townspeople had grown larger, and Margaret could sense their interest in the unusual proceedings. Mrs. Patterson from the general store stepped forward, her voice carrying across the dusty street. "Margaret Henderson is the finest judge of character in this town, and if she's willing to vouch for this man, then perhaps we should listen." Old Jim Crawford nodded his agreement, his weathered hands gripping his walking stick as he spoke. "Henry Henderson was my partner for 15 years, and he trusted Margaret's judgment above all others, and so do I." Sheriff Coleman found himself facing not just one woman's conviction but the growing support of respected community members. Margaret sensed his hesitation and pressed her advantage gently. "Sheriff, what harm can there be in allowing Thomas to remain free until trial if the evidence is as strong as you claim?" Deputy Wells started to object again, but the sheriff silenced him with a look that suggested he was reconsidering his position. Thomas looked around at the faces of people who had never seen him before yet were willing to consider the possibility of his innocence. "I give you my word," he said to Sheriff Coleman, "that I will remain in town until this matter is resolved and submit to whatever judgment the court renders." Margaret reached out and placed her hand on his bound wrists, her touch conveying the promise of support and understanding. "Sheriff Coleman, I formally request that you release Thomas Riley into my custody pending trial." The silence stretched long enough that Margaret could hear the wind moving through the oak tree's branches and the distant sound of children playing behind one of the houses. Finally Sheriff Coleman nodded slowly, his expression suggesting reluctant respect for Margaret's determination. "Very well, Mrs. Henderson, but understand that you are personally responsible for ensuring his appearance at trial." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her as Deputy Wells reluctantly cut the ropes binding Thomas's wrists. "Thank you, Sheriff," Thomas said, rubbing his freed hands. "I won't forget this kindness." Margaret guided him toward her house, aware that the entire town would be discussing her decision for weeks to come. As they walked, she found herself thinking of Henry, who had often said that courage was not the absence of fear but action taken despite fear. "You'll stay in Henry's workshop behind the house," she told Thomas. "It's comfortable enough and private, and it will give you a place to rest and recover." Thomas stopped walking for a moment, his voice thick with emotion. "Mrs. Henderson, why are you doing this for me?" Margaret considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would shape whatever relationship developed between them. "Because Thomas, sometimes we have opportunities to choose kindness over fear, and I've learned that those choices define who we are." They continued toward the house in comfortable silence, both understanding that something significant had just occurred. The workshop had been Henry's retreat during their marriage, filled with his tools and projects and the gentle spirit of a man who had believed in helping others. Margaret opened the door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar sense of wood shavings and leather that still lingered after 2 years. "Henry would have liked you," she said simply, arranging clean blankets on the small cot in the corner. Thomas looked around the space with obvious appreciation for the care and craftsmanship evident in every detail. He was a fortunate man to have you as his wife. Margaret felt tears threaten at the unexpected kindness of his words. "We were fortunate to have each other," she replied, "and now I have the chance to extend that good fortune to someone else." She showed him where to find water and food and assured him that she would speak with Dr. Matthews about tending to his injuries. "Rest now, Thomas, and tomorrow we'll begin working on clearing your name." As she closed the workshop door, Margaret realized that for the first time in months she felt a sense of purpose that went beyond her daily routines. The next morning brought news that would change everything about Thomas's situation. Dr. Matthews arrived at Margaret's kitchen door before dawn, his expression grave as he accepted her offer of coffee. "Margaret, I've just finished examining Samuel Morrison," he said, settling into Henry's chair at the kitchen table. Margaret waited patiently, understanding that the doctor often took time to organize his thoughts before sharing difficult news. "Morrison's injuries are consistent with a fall from his horse, not an assault by another person." Margaret felt her heart leap with hope. "Are you certain, doctor?" Dr. Matthews nodded slowly, his professional manner carrying the weight of years spent distinguishing between different types of injuries. "The pattern of bruising and the location of his wounds all suggest that he was thrown when his horse shied or stumbled." Margaret set down her coffee cup carefully, her mind racing with the implications of this revelation. "Does Sheriff Coleman know about this?" The doctor's expression grew troubled. "I sent word to him last night but received no response, and this morning his deputy told me the sheriff was unavailable." Margaret understood immediately that Sheriff Coleman was reluctant to acknowledge information that contradicted his predetermined conclusion. "Doctor, would you be willing to testify to your findings at Thomas's trial?" Dr. Matthews met her eyes with the steady gaze of a man accustomed to speaking difficult truths. "Margaret, I've been practicing medicine for 35 years and I know the difference between assault injuries and accident injuries." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for his professional integrity and personal courage. "Thank you, doctor, your testimony could save an innocent man's life." She walked him to the door, then made her way to the workshop where she found Thomas sitting quietly reading one of Henry's books. "Good morning, Thomas, I have news that I think will interest you." Thomas looked up with the careful expression of a man who had learned not to hope too strongly. Margaret shared Dr. Matthews' findings, watching as relief and vindication replaced the resigned acceptance in Thomas's eyes. "So Morrison was injured in an accident, not an assault," Thomas said slowly, which means the primary charge against me is false. Margaret nodded, feeling the satisfaction that came from seeing truth begin to emerge from confusion. But we still need to address the matter of you being found with his horse. Thomas stood and began pacing the small space, his energy returning as hope replaced despair. Mrs. Henderson, what if Morrison's accident happened when his horse shied and he fell and then the horse wandered away injured? Margaret followed his reasoning, understanding the logical sequence of events he was proposing. And you found the horse later trying to help it, which explains your presence at the scene. Thomas nodded eagerly, his relief evident in every gesture. It all makes sense when you consider the doctor's findings. Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that came from helping restore justice to a situation that had gone badly wrong. Thomas, we need to present this information to the sheriff and request that all charges be dropped. Thomas's expression grew cautious. Mrs. Henderson, Sheriff Coleman doesn't seem inclined to listen to evidence that contradicts his original conclusions. Margaret thought of Henry's frequent observation that some people preferred being wrong and certain to being right and uncertain. Then we'll have to make it impossible for him to ignore the truth. She spent the morning visiting neighbors and friends, building support for a public presentation of the new evidence. By afternoon she had convinced most of the town's leading citizens to attend a meeting in the church where Dr. Matthews would present his findings. Sheriff Coleman arrived reluctantly, his expression showing irritation at being pressured into public accountability. Margaret stood before the gathered townspeople, drawing strength from their presence and their commitment to fairness. Friends, we are here because new evidence has come to light regarding the charges against Thomas Riley. She gestured toward Dr. Matthews, who rose with quiet dignity to address the assembly. Ladies and gentlemen, I have examined Samuel Morrison thoroughly, and I can state with medical certainty that his injuries resulted from a fall, not from an assault. A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd as people began to understand the implications of this testimony. Sheriff Coleman stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Dr. Matthews, your medical opinion doesn't change the fact that Riley was found with stolen property. Dr. Matthews remained calm, his professional authority evident as he continued. Sheriff, if Morrison fell from his horse due to injury or fright, then the horse would naturally have wandered away, making it lost rather than stolen. Margaret stepped forward, sensing the moment when public opinion would tip decisively toward justice. Sheriff Coleman, I believe the evidence shows clearly that Thomas Riley is innocent of all charges against him. The crowd murmured agreement, and Margaret could see that Sheriff Coleman recognized his position was no longer tenable. Thomas stood slowly, his dignity intact despite the ordeal he had endured. Sheriff, I hold no hard feelings toward you or your deputies, he said quietly. You were doing your duty as you saw it. Margaret felt proud of Thomas's grace in victory, understanding that true character revealed itself in such moments. Sheriff Coleman studied Thomas's face for a long moment, then slowly removed the warrant from his pocket. Thomas Riley, I am dropping all charges against you and you are free to go. The crowd erupted in applause, and Margaret felt tears of joy and relief streaming down her cheeks. Thomas Aproac.